In the winter of 1259, the fields of Poland became a graveyard sculpted by frost. Peasants ploughing the frozen earth stumbled upon something that made them stop mid-step. Horsemen motionless, still upright in their saddles, their faces blackened by the cold and their eyes pecked clean by ravens. The Mongols, once the nightmare that had thundered across Europe like a storm of hooves and fire, now stood still frozen in place, like grotesque monuments of divine retribution. The villagers did not bury them. They built their markets around them. In the center of every small town, the dead riders became macabre decorations. Children threw snowballs at their stiffened faces. Dogs relieved themselves at their feet, and merchants hung signs from their spears, advertising bread not made from human flesh. For the first time in 2 decades, laughter returned to Poland, cruel and sharp, because the fear that had once paralyzed them had turned into something else, contempt. For 20 years, Europe had lived under the shadow of Mongol terror. They remembered the nightmare names Legnica, where the Mongols filled sacks with the ears of fallen knights, the skull cups carved from the heads of children, the plagues, the burnt cities, and the villages where even rats had been eaten. It had been said that when Mongols approached, mothers smothered their babies in silence to avoid being discovered. But that was long ago. The horror had fermented into hatred, and hatred had learned patience. Now, in 1259, when the Golden Horde rode once more across the steppes into Poland, expecting another feast of conquest, they found a land that had learned, a land that remembered, and a people who had turned their terror into something methodical, something monstrous. Duke Bolesław the Chaste, an unlikely name for a man soon to stain history with so much blood, had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment. He knew the Mongols as others knew the seasons, how they moved, how they fed, how they depended on their horses more than on men or gods. Without their mounts, they were nothing. No warriors, no conquerors, only men in furs, far from home. So Poland prepared not soldiers, but soil. 3 months before the invasion, the Duke ordered the most extensive scorched earth campaign in medieval Europe. Every field for 50 miles was burned until even worms could not survive. Wells were filled with carcasses, horses, cows, pigs left to rot and poison the groundwater. Grazing lands were salted with lime and arsenic. Villages vanished, dismantled piece by piece. Even graveyards were dug up, the bones carried away so that the Mongols could not grind them for calcium. The land itself was turned into a weapon, a wilderness of death. And most diabolical of all were the gift horses. Polish farmers, skilled breeders of strong mares, released hundreds of them into the wild, beautiful, seemingly abandoned, but each infected with glanders, a disease that ate through lungs and muscle like rot through fruit. The Mongols, seeing these mares, thought them spoils of war. They captured them. They drank their milk. They fed their herds alongside them. Within weeks, their animals began to cough blood and die. When the Mongol general Nogai Khan crossed the Vistula River with 30,000 riders, his scouts reported a silence that chilled even hardened men. The land was not conquered, it was dead. Everywhere they rode, they found emptiness. No people, no livestock, no grass, only ash. The air stank of rot, the wells bubbled with decay, and the ground was so blackened it seemed cursed. Some riders swore they saw shapes moving in the forest's figures, watching but never attacking. By the 2nd week, the gift horses began collapsing. Their necks swelled with abscesses. Their flesh rotted from within. Their lungs filled with pus until they drowned standing up. The Mongols, not understanding disease, moved the sick mounts to the rear, unwittingly spreading infection through every herd. The mighty cavalry that had once crossed continents began to crumble from the inside out. Each morning, the Khan awoke to the sound of coughing horses and dying men. The snow turned red with blood and yellow with bile. Men began cutting the throats of their own mounts to end the suffering. And still, the Polish army was nowhere to be seen. Nogai Khan, furious, ordered his men to push west. But the more they advanced, the more desolate the land became. The cold gnawed through their boots, food ran low, and horses died faster than they could be skinned. They found abandoned villages with half-eaten grain, barrels of mead that tasted sweet but made their stomachs twist in agony, poison. Even the wind carried death carcasses frozen mid-collapse, birds dead in the air, wolves feasting on the fallen. By the end of the month, the Mongol army resembled not an invading force, but a procession of the damned shuffling, starving, haunted by invisible enemies. The once feared horsemen of the steppe were now stumbling through a wasteland of their own making, and somewhere in the forests, hidden beneath the snow, Polish peasants watched in silence. For 20 years, they had lived with nightmares of fire and slaughter. Now, they waited. They had learned to move like ghosts, to kill like wolves. The time of the hunters was coming. When the land itself becomes a weapon, the people who tend it become ghosts. Through the skeletal forests of southern Poland, peasants moved like whispers. They wore rags dyed brown with soil, faces smeared with soot, bodies wrapped in straw for warmth. These were not knights, nor soldiers. They were fathers, brothers, sonsmen, who had buried their families after the Mongols' first invasion 20 years before. They did not march for glory, they hunted for vengeance. Duke Bolesław the Chaste had given them simple orders: kill them as you would kill wolves. No banners, no horns, no honor, just death, fast and silent. At night, the forests came alive with motionless watchers. Mongol scouting parties would stop to make camp, building small fires against the cutting wind. They would tie their horses, take off their armor, and fall into exhausted sleep. Then, without a sound, the hunters came. Throats slit in darkness. Horses fell first. Always the horses. A Mongol warrior would wake to the warmth of blood soaking through the snow and the silence of his dead mounts. The forest gave no echo, no clue of who had done it. By dawn, only hoofprints remained, Polish prints leading nowhere. For Mongols, whose entire way of life depended on their horses, this was not just loss, it was annihilation. Without horses, they were trapped, slow-moving prey in a frozen wilderness. Some tried to march back east, dragging their saddles behind them. None made it far. Within a fortnight, the vast steppe army had become a mass of starving men, surrounded by invisible executioners. Those who tried to forage found nothing. Every storehouse, every millstone, every buried granary had been emptied. What few supplies they discovered were left there on purpose. Barrels of mead and sacks of grain were bait poisoned with hemlock and wolfsbane, just enough to make the victims die slowly. Mongols who feasted on them felt the first cramps within hours, agonizing, twisting pain that turned their insides to fire. When they collapsed, they were found days later with dried blood on their lips and fingers clawed into the dirt. Even the birds refused to eat the corpses. One Mongol captain named Bedar wrote a letter to Nogai Khan, found centuries later in the ruins of a burned village. It read, "The enemy is nowhere and everywhere. We conquer only ghosts. My men bleed from the mouth. The horses eat each other's manes. This land is cursed, and cursed it was by memory, by rage, by the calculated patience of men who had once been victims." Duke Bolesław's strategy wasn't born of genius, but of grief. The Mongols had taught Europe lessons in fear. Now, Poland was teaching them lessons in pain. The Duke had forbidden his men to seek open battle. He wanted the Mongols to die without ever seeing their killers. It was working. By mid-January, Mongol scouts reported entire units lost, vanished without combat. One detachment of 500 men had camped beside a frozen stream. When they awoke, every horse lay dead in a perfect circle around the camp, throats slit, arranged like an offering to some dark god. Not a single sentry had seen or heard the killers. The message was unmistakable: we can kill you whenever we want. Fear is a contagion more lethal than plague. The once mighty riders of the East, who had faced knights and empires, began to fear the dark itself. They kept torches burning all night, their eyes darting at every shadow. Some refused to sleep. Others killed their own comrades, accusing them of witchcraft. One Mongol lieutenant, driven mad by hunger, slit open a dying horse to sleep inside its belly for warmth. He froze to death before morning. Every day, the forests whispered of vengeance. Wolves followed the Mongol columns, drawn by the trail of carcasses. Crows grew fat on the eyes of the fallen. And above it all, unseen, Polish hunters tracked every movement, counting, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. In Krakow, Duke Bolesław gathered his commanders. His scouts had mapped the Mongol advance, 30,000 strong, reduced to barely half their number. Their morale shattered, their mounts diseased. He could have attacked then and there, but he didn't. He wanted them deeper trapped. He retreated west toward the Vistula, drawing the Mongols after him like moths to flame. Along the way, his men dug trenches under the snow, lined pits with sharpened stakes, smeared in dung to ensure infection. They disguised them with branches and frost. What looked like an open plain was now a graveyard waiting to be filled. Meanwhile, his peasants prepared for what they called the Great Harvest. Their tools were not swords or lances, but grain flails, scythes, hammers, and hooks, the instruments of daily labor turned into weapons. They practiced on pig carcasses, learning where to strike to cripple, how to hook a man's leg from behind to pull him down. Every man who had lost a wife or child to the Mongols took up a blade. Every village sent its hunters. Every forest hid its ghosts. For 2 decades, Poland had been Europe's bleeding wound. Now, the wound was closing and the scar would be carved into Mongol flesh. By late winter, the Golden Horde reached the outskirts of Sandomierz, exhausted, starving, and half-maddened. Nogai Khan saw smoke rising ahead, polished banners fluttering over frozen fields. Finally, an enemy he could see. But it was no salvation. It was a snare, a killing field designed for one purpose. The hunters had drawn their prey into the open. At dawn, the fog rolled across the plains of Sandomierz like a shroud. Beneath it, the Mongols advanced, an army of ghosts that still believed itself made of iron. They saw Polish banners flapping against the pale light and thought they understood what awaited them. Another clumsy European force, knights in shining armor, eager for a heroic death. They had crushed hundreds like them before. This would be no different, or so they thought. Nogai Khan raised his arm. The horns blew. Mongol light cavalry surged forward, loosing arrows in a black storm. Their formation unfolded flawlessly, feigned retreat, encirclement, annihilation. It was the dance of death they had performed from the steppes of China to the hills of Hungary. But this time, something was wrong. The Poles didn't chase. The knights stood motionless, shields locked, lances grounded in the earth. Behind them, rows of infantry waited in silence. The Mongols wheeled around for a second pass. Suddenly, chaos. Their horses stumbled. Legs broke with sickening cracks. The earth itself betrayed them. Hidden beneath the snow lay trenches and pits, lined with sharpened stakes and coated in filth. Horses screamed as they fell, impaled, throwing their riders into a tangle of blood and terror. The pristine white field turned red in moments. When the Mongols tried to regroup, the ground collapsed again under their hooves. They had entered a killing field perfectly crafted to destroy cavalry, the one weapon they had always trusted. From the tree lines on either flank, crossbowmen emerged silent as the dead. They did not aim for the riders. They aimed for the horses. Each shot was deliberate, surgical. Every arrow that struck brought down another mount, and with it, another Mongol doomed to die on foot. Nogai Khan screamed for order, but the panic spread like fire. The thundering unity of the Mongol horde broke apart into clusters of men shouting in a dozen tongues. The smell of blood and dung choked the air. Then, from the distant hills, the next wave arrived, not knights, but peasants. They came in rags and armor scavenged from the dead, carrying flails, scythes, pitchforks, hammers. Farmers, blacksmiths, millers, shepherds, thousands of them, moving with the rhythm of the fields they once tilled. They weren't soldiers, they were executioners. What followed wasn't war, it was labor. One Polish chronicler wrote, "They did not fight as warriors, but as workers of death." Men swung flails as if threshing grain, crushing skulls with the same casual precision they used to crush wheat. Hooks dragged Mongols down into the mud, where hammers finished the job. Blood spattered across the snow, steaming in the cold air. Peasants worked in pairs and trios, moving methodically, singing to keep rhythm. Their song echoed across the valley. A farmer's hymn turned into a dirge of vengeance. For every Mongol ear delivered, 1 silver penny. For a thumb, 2 pennies. For a commander's head gold. It was called the harvest of ears. Some peasants cut both ears from the same corpse, selling the extra to neighbors less fortunate. Others strung fingers into necklaces, worn as charms against future invasions. Even children joined in, gathering trophies in baskets. By the end, the field resembled a slaughterhouse. Steam, screams, and the steady, rhythmic sound of reaping. Nogai Khan's command tent fell before sunset. Captured alive by Duke Bolesław's men, he was stripped naked, smeared with pig's blood, and mounted backward on a donkey. The Duke paraded him through 20 villages, where peasants jeered and threw refuse. In each village, the crowd was allowed to cut off one small piece of him, a finger joint, a bit of ear, a toe never enough to kill. By the final village, Nogai was a mutilated ruin, begging for death. The Duke granted it, but not mercifully. They castrated him with sheep shears and sent him back east as a message. This is what Europe does to invaders now. It was the most eloquent sentence of the age. But the slaughter did not end in it spreads west into Bohemia, south into Austria. The Mongols had awakened something they could not put back to sleep. At Kressenbrunn, the Bohemians under King Ottokar II faced the remnants of the horde in open field. This time, Europe's knights did not rush to die. They formed hollow squares bristling with pikes, a forest of steel that no horse could penetrate. Swiss mercenaries with crossbows filled the spaces between, their bolts turning Mongol charges into massacre. When the Mongols wheeled to fire arrows, they found that the new European plate armor, heavier, thicker, forged from layered steel, rendered their weapons useless. The air was filled with the hiss of arrows bouncing harmlessly off armor. Mongol tactics had become obsolete in a single generation, and when their horses, exhausted and pierced, finally faltered, the counterattack began. Bohemian knights, mounted on massive destriers bred for crushing weight, descended like an avalanche. They swung warhammers designed not to pierce but to shatter, crumpling Mongol lamellar armor and bone alike. The impact was apocalyptic. By dusk, so many bodies covered the ground that Ottokar ordered his men to stop taking ears. There were simply too many. Instead, they piled heads into pyramids, grim markers along the trade road from Vienna to Prague. 50 pyramids, each made from hundreds of skulls. Further east, the Mongol survivors fled into the Carpathian Mountains, driven by hunger and snow. There, winter waited the cruelest general of all. The few thousand who survived Sandomierz and Kressenbrunn wandered into a labyrinth of frozen passes, where the forests whispered and the wind howled like wolves. For the first few days, they ate their horses, then leather belts, then bark and snow. By the fourth week, they began eating each other. When spring came, Hungarian patrols found their campfires burned low, bones split open for marrow, ribs gnawed clean. Some bodies were missing heads. Others had been carefully butchered, like livestock. One recovered journal contained the confession, "We ate Timur yesterday. He was my brother-in-arms for 6 years. His liver was black with spots, but we ate it anyway. Tomorrow they will share me." The Mongols had once been the world's predators. Now, they were prey devoured by the land, the cold, and each other. In Polish villages below the mountains, peasants waited for the thaw. When they found the frozen corpses, they stripped them of armor, weapons, even teeth. Skulls became drinking cups, tendons became bowstrings. It was a reversal so complete it bordered on divine justice. The invincible horsemen of the East had vanished into the snow, leaving behind only bones and songs of vengeance, sung by men who once tilled the earth. By the time the snow melted, the Mongol horde was gone. The earth itself seemed to exhale, as if purging the memory of their hooves. But what remained was not peace, it was transformation. Europe had learned something terrible about itself. In Poland, Duke Bolesław ordered that a monument be built on the killing fields of Sandomierz. Peasants gathered the scattered bones, bleaching them in the sun, grinding some into powder. These bones, mixed into the mortar, became the foundation of a small stone church, the Church of Divine Vengeance. Its altar stood upon the very spot where Nogai Khan had been castrated. The walls were decorated with skulls arranged in the shape of crosses. For 2 centuries, it stood as a reminder not of faith, but of retribution until embarrassed priests tore it down, calling it unchristian. But by then, the lesson was already burned into Europe's soul. To survive the Mongols, you had to become worse than them. Farther south, the survivors who had escaped into Hungary stumbled into the cruelest fate of all. The Venetian merchants, ever practical about profit, saw opportunity where others saw horror. They bought starving Mongol captives from Hungarian peasants for next to nothing. The once proud riders were now half-mad skeletons, chained and crawling, many missing ears, fingers, or eyes. The Venetians loaded them onto ships bound for the slave markets of Alexandria and Cairo, where the Mamluks, their very men once enslaved by Mongols, took grim pleasure in owning the sons of their conquerors. The ships themselves were floating hells, chained in holds meant for cargo. The captives lay in their own filth. Disease spread faster than mercy. Some went mad and chewed their wrists open to escape. Others whispered prayers in the dark, begging the eternal sky to take them home. But there was no home left. The children suffered most. Boys under 10 were castrated and sold as eunuchs to guard the harems of sultans. Out of 3, maybe 1 survived the crude surgery. The rest bled to death in the streets. Mongol girls, famed for their sharp eyes and pale complexions, were sold to brothels across the Mediterranean, advertised as daughters of the conquerors. A Venetian trader named Marco Sanudo wrote, almost casually, "The Tartars make poor slaves. They fight like wolves even when chained. Some hang themselves with their own hair. Others bite." To him they were just another commodity. To history, they were the broken fragments of an empire that once claimed to rule beneath the eternal blue sky. But vengeance in Europe was not yet satisfied. Word of the Polish victories spread across the continent like wildfire. Kings, dukes, even minor lords who had once trembled at the Mongol name began issuing bounties for heads, ears, and scalps. Historians would later call it the Mongol Hunt of 1261 to 1263. In the forests of the east, bands of Teutonic knights roamed with fire and pitch. When they caught Mongol stragglers, they tied them to stakes, covered them in tar, and set them alight, sending them running like human torches back into their own camps. Hungarian barons impaled prisoners along their borders as living warnings. Polish peasants displayed skulls on church gates, and children played a game called Hunt the Tartar, with captured helmets for prizes. Across Christendom, the Invincible had become prey. And still, the Golden Horde tried once more. In 1262, a final punitive expedition of 10,000 riders crossed into Poland. But this time, the land itself rebelled. Church bells rang in every village, carrying the alarm for 50 miles. Within hours, every field was emptied, every well poisoned, every barn burned. When the Mongols drank from the rivers, they tasted rot. When they slept, unseen hands stole their horses. When they marched, flocks of ravens followed like omens. They were no longer fighting an army, they were fighting a country that had learned to kill in silence. The commander Bundai reported before his death, "We do not fight men, but the land itself. Every tree hides an archer, every stream is poisoned, every village is empty, yet watching. This is not war, it is digestion." After 2 weeks, the Mongols broke. They retreated eastward, leaving their dead behind. As they crossed the border, Polish children stood on the hills, hurling stones at them and singing songs that mocked their fall from glory. The once mighty horsemen of the world were being laughed at by peasants. The Mongols never came back, and across Europe the myth of their invincibility died. In 1241, the Mongols had been the apocalypse, the horsemen of God's wrath. By 1263, they were market goods, bones in church walls, and stories told to frighten children. The eternal sky had cracked, and through it, something darker had risen. For the Mongols had taught Europe the logic of fear, the science of cruelty, and the efficiency of extermination. But in teaching those lessons, they had created their own executioners. The Polish peasants, who once prayed for deliverance, had learned that mercy was weakness, that to survive monsters, you must become one. Centuries later, archaeologists would still find the evidence. Mass graves along the Carpathian passes, filled with skeletons bearing teeth, marks proof of cannibalism. Churches whose mortar tested positive for human calcium, the powdered bones of Mongol warriors mixed into sacred walls. Peasant families that still, even in the 19th century, kept modified scythes and flails, passed down as heirlooms the tools their ancestors had used to harvest men. The Mongols called their empire the eternal blue sky, but even the sky ends at the edge of a peasant's blade, and so the story ends where it began, frozen soil, where men once feared to fight and later learned to kill, where the hunted became the hunters, where the sheep learned to be wolves.